Hello folks, and welcome to this course on Java Optional and Null. Now, looking at the length of the course and all these sections that run along the left, you might be wondering why we've got such a lengthy course on something as seemingly simple as Java's optional. Well, the truth is that null pointer exceptions have been a real pain for Java developers for around 20 years. Null references have been described as the billion-dollar mistake. An incredible amount of developer time over the years has been wasted trying to prevent null pointer exceptions and checking for them, checking for nulls, and also tracking down the real cause of a null pointer exception once it's occurred. So optional was introduced in Java JDK 8 and is here to address some of these issues around handling null references. So it can be very difficult to trace the real source of the problem once a null pointer exception has occurred. Is it the line of code? Is it a particular part of the line of code? Is it caused by the code that called that code? So there's often a lot of confusion about where the problem originated. And there's often a lot of confusion about the best way to handle it from a design perspective. So do you have code with lots and lots of null checks and then other code with no null checks? Do you use default values? There's confusion around whether you should use primitives or objects because they have different characteristics when it comes to null. So in my experience, there's just generally very little consistency in the way that nulls are handled in most applications. Optional, which was here to solve some of those problems, is often kind of used or misused in in almost every single pull request or merge request that I've had to review. So the problem of null references and the solution or partial solution of using Java optional is pretty much ubiquitous. You'll see it in almost every bit of code. And therefore, if it's used incorrectly and there's kind of a misunderstanding of the best way to use it, that can really add up over time. And so it's important to get the design aspects of using optional and other null considerations right pretty early on in the development cycle of your project. So we are going to go into a lot of detail about null. Now, a quick bit about this course, we use Java 11, and later on we touch on some Java 14 and even some other programming languages. But most of the functionality of Java optional has been around since Java 8. But if you are on Java 8, just be mindful that some of the methods that we'll talk about were introduced in later versions. So what are we going to cover? So we're going to cover a basic introduction to null, more information about null, default values. We're going to cover storage. We're going to cover design considerations, why we need optional. We are going to talk about how null reference or null pointer exceptions were handled before optional. What do some of the other languages do? We're going to look at when is the best time to use optional, when not to use it, overuse. We are going to look at various methods on optional, also the OR family of methods and when you should use which ones. Some of them can be a tad confusing. We are going to look at the map method, the flat map method, filter, the similarities with streams, some of the similarities that optional has with streams. We are going to look at equality, stream method. We're going to look at specialized optionals and when they should be used. We are going to look at the null annotations that have been around for quite a while, things like this. We're going to look at checker frameworks, null object pattern, what was introduced in Java 14 that may help us with null pointer exceptions. We're going to look at null functions, and we are going to look at some interesting stuff around functional programming, whether Java's optional is a monad or not. Do we care? What does it mean? Arguments for and against. We are going to look at some alternatives to optional, such as what was available in Guava, it's available in Veva, in Palatable Lambda. Then we're going to take a quick look at some other languages like Scala, Haskell, Kotlin, and what do they do about null? And we are going to look at an interesting programming language called Dart that has something called sound null safety. So as you can see, there's quite a lot to get through. Let's go back to our introduction. So as you can see, there's quite a lot to get through. So just coming back to the introduction, at the end of many of the sections, especially the more confusing ones, I'm likely to ask a few questions just to check your understandings. That'd be good if you can answer those before we're moving on to the next section. And by the end of the course, I'm hoping that you will be very confident understanding the concept of null in considering the best design approach for handling nulls in your application, so you don't end up with 10 different ways of doing it, and some of them very poor and some of them very good, but just generally inconsistent. And I'm hopeful you'll be very confident in using optional in the way that it was intended, with lots of the cool functions and features that it has, and not overusing it or using it in ways that is not appropriate. So there's lots to get through, and let's get started.